Well, welcome everyone to Franciscans International. Some people are still connecting in at this time, I can see. If you wish to turn on your camera as well, that's fine, but or otherwise. But thank you for coming and being a part of us here today. This is an opportunity for us to share together a little of the experience during this time of the commission, like the Commission on the Status of Women that's going on here at the United Nations during these 2 weeks. It started on Monday, it ends next Friday. And during this time, we also have 3 women with us who are from other aspects of Franciscan family, Franciscan institutions, and so forth. But first, a little bit of introduction, actually, for those of you who don't know me yet. My name is Jim Donegan. I'm a Capuchin friar, Capuchin brother, and I'm the Franciscan Liaison officer here in the New York office. And directly across the table from me is Marya Farah. She can say what she does.
Hi everyone, I'm the UN New York representative for Franciscans International.
And with us today are 3 3 women who have been participating with us during these days. Came here earlier this week and been participating for Wednesday, Thursday, and today. And so I don't know, maybe if you each could just say your name and what organization are you with, or what's your connection to the Franciscan family, and you know, what sort of area of advocacy or justice work do you already do in that role, in that context? So I don't know, we could start directly to my left here with with Kelly.
Hi everyone, Kelly Moltzen. I am a secular Franciscan and I am part of the JPIC Commission for the Franciscan Federation, co-chairing that with Sister Pat Millen. And it's the JPIC Commission, so it can encompass many different things. The resolutions that have been passed by the Commission are around immigration, care for creation, racism, and environmental racism. So that's the background of the JPIC Commission.
Hi everyone, I'm Eileen DeGuire. I am the Legislative Director for the Franciscan Action Network and a Franciscan Mission Service volunteer. And my primary focus in advocacy is immigration, but kind of do a little bit of everything.
Hi everybody, my name is Rosie Davila and I work as the Communications and Development Coordinator for Franciscan Action Network. I'm also an artist for Pace y Bene, so we work in nonviolence education and training, and also in ending environmental destruction and war.
And one of the things which I want to just say to everybody who is online, questions may come up or might come to your mind as we're talking. And so if they do, please put them in the chat. We'll be watching out for them in the chat. But in the meantime, I'll kind of throw some seed questions out there to get some conversation going. But I'm sure that other ideas will come along here. It's great having, you know, the 3 of you, each of you working in different areas in some ways, but at the same time, there are connections all along that come together here at the UN. For each of you, first time here at the UN, second time, 100th time? Well, how many times have you been here to the UN?
It's my first time at the UN, so very exciting, glad to be here.
It's my first time as well. I did model UN throughout high school, so getting to see the real things was really exciting.
It's not my first time at the UN. I actually came to CSW last year with Franciscans International, but I've been to other UN events over the years, maybe about like a half dozen to a dozen or so.
How many times for you, Marya?
Too many.
Too many. Okay. I guess with staff, the question is a little unfair, but but you know, what expectations did you have coming here? What was on your mind before you got on the train?
I was hoping to learn a lot from different people and meet people who are working in, you know, things that connect very heavily to our work. And I think it's just been amazing to see the just all the strong women who are here doing so much amazing things, so many amazing things in their countries and all across the globe. So that was my main expectation, and I'm happy to meet you.
Yeah, I don't know that I had any major expectations per se. I just knew it was going to be really cool to see. I mean, basically, what Rosie said, what everyone is doing around the world, and seeing the role that fans' issues play as part of that.
Yeah, so for me, I think I was coming in just remembering what I kind of got out of the CSW last year, and my day-to-day work is mostly around food systems. So I was thinking about the connection between food systems and women, and the need for uplifting women so that they can do more and address climate change and be the breadwinners in their houses and uplift the food system. So yeah, I guess I was just looking to build more on that, and to see, how we can go deeper into all these different issues that are impacting women across the world.
And I mean, one of the things which you find, I mean, you've been to a number of events, you see the connections actually with these sorts of issues that you're already working with, and also how that affects women and girls throughout the entire world. Maybe just a little bit for all of you, just give a little bit of context. One of the things that takes place at these major events at the UN are what they refer to as side events and parallel events. So you have sort of the main events around that involves the sort of diplomatic discourse, shall we say, but then you have all these other events that are sponsored by specific diplomatic corps of particular countries, or maybe certain UN agencies, or especially in some of the other events that take place outside of the UN grounds, but around in the area. They call them parallel events, which are not sponsored directly by the UN, but are in conjunction with the Commission on the Status of Women as it takes place. And many of those become sponsored by various NGOs then as well that are working on particular issues. I don't know if there'd be more to describe on that, Marya, since you've been involved with this much more all along, and with the side events, or what else could we say there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one way for people to be engaged and to have their stories told. So you have a lot of side events that are really focused on country issues or thematic issues. And I was speaking with Kelly about this of, if it's a thematic issue, you can see countries that maybe they wouldn't typically work together, but they say they have the same kind of either businesses that are coming in and stealing their natural resources or appropriating their natural resources is a nicer way to put it. Or they have maybe the same kind of human rights issues they face. So people coming together to discuss and also highlight the context that they're in. And it's a way for people to not just have their stories told, but to connect with others and maybe share experiences and best practices and moving forward.
And kind of keeping that in mind, I mean, I guess one question which I have is, what were a couple of the side events that you thought that you yourselves went to that kind of sparked some thoughts for you, especially in light of some of the stuff you already do? Could you kind of, what did you see that in the course of these days?
One that particularly stood out to me was the Greek embassy to the UN, and then UN Women put on an event about women in positions of power and how different countries have been approaching that major gap. And so it was interesting to see how other countries have handled this issue. I mean, there is not close to equality in the US right now, but seeing how other countries have gotten to at least closer was really interesting. And hearing from some of those women who are involved in that process directly was really interesting as someone who works with, the US government on a daily basis, directly or indirectly. And then the other one today was a session on immigration, specifically as it applies to Chinese and Taiwanese immigrants to the US, which I think are commonly kind of lost in the shuffle, especially right now. There's a lot of focus on Latinx immigration to the US. So seeing how those two populations of immigrants are handling this process, it was really just interesting and a reminder that, you know, there isn't one demographic that is trying to immigrate to the US and come here.
And that part about leadership being something which affects all of those other issues really in many ways, because if women's voices aren't part of the leadership process, then also that affects how those other issues such as immigration or climate or whatever might be addressed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Rosie, what ones did you see that struck you in particular?
Yeah, we went to one the first day that kind of focused around like food and nutrition in different countries. So I thought one of the things that really stood out to me was that they were talking about how in Malawi they have enshrined the right to food in their constitution, and how despite those efforts and those policies, they're still having trouble getting people access to food, and particularly women, and nutritious food. And how the best thing that they can do right now is really clear communication with women about what their rights are and what they have available to them. And so for me, as someone who works in communications at Franciscan Action Network, that kind of stood out to me, because I was like, yeah, we need stories of, you know, what's happening on the ground with our constituents, with our network. And we need to be sending those out so that people can just honestly really be aware of what's going on and how they can help and how we can all work together to hopefully make things just a little bit better or a lot better. So I think clear communication is power, and that really stood out to me from the UN sessions.
I was with you in that one. I remember there was one story in particular, at least that where there was of a woman who had been married for 60 years.
Right.
And do you remember the rest of that story, how that went?
Yeah, and then her husband died, and I think it was that she did not essentially get the rights to the land that was her husband's land, and that goes against their laws. But because of their cultural norms, that was still kind of working against her essentially. And so, you know, also the awareness that we need to, you know, have our communication be flexible culturally was kind of stood out to me from that as well.
And also, I guess how that expectation, that norm, that understanding of the right to eat is hindered at this point. And that part is related to cultural understanding of that's related to the fact that this is a woman, and the fact that she's a widow didn't have an additional safeguard of any kind apparently in this particular instance. And I'm trying to imagine what that must mean. That it's like you never actually have food security,
right? And
that because of that very reality. I think it's really key the way you put that of communication being very important, because of how ideas can be talked about, they can be put down on paper, they then can be signed, everybody says we agree on this, and then something still falls apart. So that communications part is such an important thing. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you. Kelly, what did you?
Yeah, just to build on that session a little, I think what I appreciated was how they talked about, so in I guess it was two countries, in Malawi, I think in Nepal, they have the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the World Food Program all working together in these countries, and they're incorporating in these like strategies to advance, you know, women's rights, so helping them to get access to land and to the funds needed in order to get started more in the agricultural business, and how it had been successful. I remember in Nepal, like reducing stunting, and that also had stood out to me. But I was just also struck by like, why are these three food like entities of the UN only working together in two countries? Why can't they find these collaborations in every country that they're working in? I don't know enough about the UN, but to know why that's the case. But that did stick out to me. Another session that stuck out to me was there was a session yesterday on the Women, Faith and Climate Network, which was launched through the Dandelion Project, that I guess Mary Robinson from Ireland had started. And they're doing this in collaboration with the UN Environment Office and the Faith for Earth initiative there. So I thought that was really encouraging. I think they launched it last November or so. But just to see how there can be this collaboration around looking at the intersection of women, faith, and climate, especially in terms of like, you know, women's ability to just recognizing the strength that women have in, you know, caring for creation. And I think that's like part of like who we are in terms of like, you know, being nurturing and, you know, being in tune with Mother Earth, and just how there can be an opportunity to lift up more women in doing this work around the climate space, and people who are also coming from a place of faith. So I thought that was pretty encouraging to learn about, and I am interested in looking more into it.
And one question which I have is like, from what you've seen so far, you know, this is just like a taste of what goes on, because there's so many things that go on in the CSW, and it's just for a few days that you've been here. But what would you see as ways that your expectations have changed then from that when you came, and now, okay, you've had this experience of engaging the UN system here. What's changed for you then?
I don't know that anything's necessarily changed. I would say there's just more of an appreciation and understanding of everything the UN does. I mean, I think we talk about it as this major international non-governmental organization that you know, helps avert conflict or condemns human rights abuses, showing that just how involved they are in things like environment and clean energy. And you know, you hear about these agencies, you know, like the Environmental Agency and then UN Women and things like that, but seeing, you know, when it comes down to it, what they're actually doing and how they're supporting people on the ground, I think was really interesting to see the tangible impact of that.
Yeah, I think for me, the main thing that changed is that I thought that it was going to be like, honestly, a lot less events and less people here. And I just realized how broad this event is, and just how many organizations are represented, and what an extreme variety of work they're doing. And I think that was just very inspirational and motivational for me, because I was like, wow, there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work.
Yeah, I also don't know if anything specifically changed, but more so, I guess being like refreshed or enhanced, or like just, I mean, I heard many times about the power of storytelling, but you know, somebody shared that storytelling is like 22 times more effective than just listing data, because people forget data, but they don't forget stories. So I thought that was a really good reminder of the importance of hearing people's stories, and of like really, you know, I think a lot of what these sessions give us is concrete examples of how people are dealing with these situations on the ground in their local communities. And the more that we know these concrete examples, like, you know, one of the sessions I went to was on, you know, women in the clean energy sector, and like, what are these different countries doing to uplift women in clean energy? And the more that we hear these stories, the more that we can build a more cohesive narrative of like what's actually happening across the world. You know, when we talk about like immigration and climate change, and you know, like women's rights and, you know, human rights and all these different issues of poverty, right? Like, how are they actually intersecting on the ground level? And I think just going to these sessions and hearing the stories really helps to build that picture, so that we can create that more comprehensive understanding of what's actually happening.
You know, it's interesting, Rosie, you mentioned there's so many different groups, and it shows just how many different dimensions there are to this work. And it's something where things aren't just of the reality of any one country either, or any one particular perspective. There are factors that relate to things having to do with industry, things that relate to matters of the environment, things that relate to immigration, things that relate to nutrition, things that relate to all the different elements of human life. And so yeah, it's one of the pieces where you don't really get a chance to see all that together until you bring all these pieces together. And I think that's one of the interesting things also for us, at least within the Franciscan family, is that I can say this as a professed Franciscan, the now over 20 years, we don't have any one thing we do, it's not like we do schools, we do hospitals. Well, many Franciscans do schools, many Franciscans do hospitals, many Franciscans do advocacy work, many Franciscans do all kinds of different things, and it's a wide range of different types of things. I guess another question I have would be, like, from what you've seen, what sort of nuggets do you think that you could share that could be helpful to not just the Franciscans and folks working with Franciscans and people with Franciscan hearts and so forth that are here with us this afternoon, but that they could share as well to others? Like, what could help us in that mission, in that Franciscan mission, from what you've seen these 3 days?
My immediate answer is communication and coordination. I think we've seen, there's like countries from all over, and in panels we've seen, like, okay, Zimbabwe is doing a panel with Ireland, two very different parts of the world, two very different countries, but they can come together, and like Marya was saying earlier, on common themes and common causes. And so I think any way that we can continue to collaborate, whether that's in advocacy, whether that's in work in education or something else like that, I think continuing to take advantage of all of our gifts, because everyone has different ones, is super important. And so I know this is something at FAN that we're trying to do more, is use our network and hear everyone's stories, and continue to use that in our advocacy. So that's my immediate response.
Probably something someone can do and say, actually, I'm a communications director.
Still the communications bit, my bad.
The unclear communication. I agree completely.
Yeah, I guess like one little bit that I took out of the session, I think it was this morning I went to on, they kind of mapped out, like, what is your, the sphere that you can sort of impact directly, and then like your sphere of influence and your sphere of concern. And I feel like so many times, like, there's just so many issues in the world, and it's just kind of like overwhelming to think about how do we address these issues. Like I'm doing this little part right here, but then there's all these other parts, but like really focusing on the sphere of influence, and like who are the people that you can influence, and like maybe you can't address everything through the sphere of concern, but like, what can we actually influence through our individual and our organizational connections, and just like building on that, and maybe like mapping them out more across organizations to say, who are we actually trying to influence? And what are we trying to accomplish? And yeah, I don't know, just maybe kind of trying to focus more on that to try to accomplish more, rather than sort of just getting overwhelmed as to like the state of the world and not knowing where to start. But
you could even make it Franciscan with the whole "what is ours to do?"
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something that we started talking about with the JPIC Commission.
Yeah. I mean, I guess thinking of like the JPIC Commission, I imagine you're looking at a fair amount of how can you take the experiences that members of all the different Franciscan communities that are part of the Franciscan Federation have, and kind of bring that together somehow. Did you see like a way in which there's a commonality between what you already do with the JPIC Commission and the way things work here, or do you see as very different realities that just hard to see how you make the connection necessarily?
I mean, I think that, and we've tried to start exploring this a little bit, but it's not completely clear yet. But, just looking at the intersections between sort of like the national scope and the international scope, and FAN is focused on like, and also the Franciscan Federation with the statements that they've made around like, immigration and care for creation or environmental issues. And there's very specific things that we want to say about these, but what are the intersections? And the intersections happen when you talk about like, climate change being one of the root causes of immigration, right? And like how we can look at more of these interconnected issues and how are they playing out in the international sphere, and like what do we need to communicate more to a domestic audience in the US about these things to better paint a clearer picture about what's actually going on. And then if that has US policy implications or, you know, whatever that is, then we can talk about what those are. But yeah, I think that we need to look closer at these interconnected issues and the areas of intersection.
Looking at it from a perspective of doing legislative work in the US context, how do you see does it go together? Is it very different?
I would say there's yes and no. I mean, I would say in that it is different and the same. I would say, I mean, as many people know, and as we've discussed, FAN is a very domestic focused organization. But obviously there are all these international implications. Like we've seen we've been hearing stuff about the USAID cuts. That's a domestic issue, and that's a foreign policy issue because so many of our international partners are getting majorly affected by that. And so yeah, I would say yeah, that's kind of my immediate answer to that.
There were two side events I went to which made reference to the USAID cuts and how that affects all of the rest, and then comes down the line in terms of particularly the vulnerability in many parts of the world for women and girls. So it is very key that the connections are there. You were about to say something, so I did. Okay, go ahead. Okay. But I do remember when we were at one event, but you were Rosie, you were going up to people as soon as you could after every event.
Yes.
So this is something, and I remember thinking to myself, okay, there's a communications director right there, because you know that's the kind of thing we should do. You make sure you get contacts and so forth. But I mean, how do you see that sort of aspect as being different from being on the domestic side?
Well, I mean, in some ways, there's easier accessibility. I went up to someone who's a parliamentarian in Egypt, and she gave me her phone number and said, text me. I've never had a US representative or congressperson of any kind give me their phone number. So I think that was kind of striking for me. So I don't know, Eileen, but
official accessibility was huge.
Just accessibility was what stood out to me the most.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a different context than the way we normally operate with them, but the fact that she was even willing to do that in the first place is
right,
amazing.
It was a surprise, but a good surprise.
Right. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I get maybe Marya, you could speak to this a little better. The side events and everything. Oftentimes, the folks who are coming, so as much the organizers as those who are presenting, as those who are just sitting in there, often trying to make more connections and contacts as well. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons that people come and attend is, you know, there is a political declaration, but it's non-binding. It's just a declaration for the CSW. So there's nothing to work for that's, and I'll phrase it in a maybe nicer way, nothing concrete that's binding that states that, okay, now we have this obligation, even though they already have usually the same obligations under international human rights law and other frameworks that are put into these declarations. So people come, they listen to others, have their stories be told, and I think it's a good way to, as you've said, meet others, meet contacts from other organizations. You do have a little bit more access to UN officials as well if you were able to get up to them, because it's also very crowded. And I think it's definitely one of the main benefits and objectives of these sessions is to make contacts and see, as you've all said, how we can all work together with your spheres of influence and, you know, making sure that we're all pushing in the same directions.
And then some people undoubtedly are going to a certain set, and there are others who have some sort of a set that has got something in common there, but not everything, and some others are in other ones and so forth. So somehow that gets some of that communication together. I think it's very important. One of the things which Marya just mentioned is that the work that's done, that there is a political declaration at the end, But it doesn't have the weight of obligation. It's a non-binding agreement at the end. So it's the other work that everybody is doing in communicating with other that might make more of a probability of change around the world. To get a sense of like, I don't know, maybe 3 days is quite enough time for this, but how, advocacy itself works differently.
In like an international. versus
Yeah,
domestic.
international versus domestic, yeah.
We're the same.
I was like, there's a lot, I mean, there's certainly some overlap. I mean, you're looking at, I think we've had this conversation too of who the kind of power players are and whether that's business, whether that's certain countries are able to, push their weight around a little bit more. And that kind of, so that's going to happen at pretty much any level. I think it feels that much more formal, I think, at this level. I think there's, and I'm sure, we're obviously only seeing one perspective of it, but seeing, these very sit down parliamentary procedure, like forming the political declaration and stuff, absolutely. And of course there's the language and cultural divide too. So I think there's a lot of things that are kind of that much more at the international level, whether it's cultural differences or how people handle things. And so I think that's kind of it's a similarity and a difference at the same time, of kind of the magnitude of how people handle things.
Did you say the same thing, or you got something else?
No, I just feel like, I mean, the sort of the way that things work at the UN, right, is like there's these sessions and people have their prepared marks and give their interventions, and like I feel like the comments generally are like very well thought out, and like the way that people prepare things, and and there's both there's the stuff inside the UN, and there's also like lots of side events outside the UN. And then there's walks, like Marya, both last year and this year is, organized, well, not, participated in a walk around, the Palestine Gaza issue and everything. And like, that's another form of advocacy, right? So, yeah, I think there are some similarities, but then like, there's also differences. I mean, advocacy in some senses, like when people go and talk to their like Congress members, like many times people have very well prepared remarks, but then there's also like, protests out in the streets, like, like that type of advocacy. And like, I don't see as much of that here. But yeah, I'm sure lots of that protest is happening in countries around the world in their own context as well. So yeah, I think it's just different in terms of like the UN being more of like a formal official space that we see people with their, very prepared remarks and everything.
As a communications person, do you see that as the case? The remarks are very prepared, polished?
Yes, very.
Okay.
They feel very thought out beforehand, and I've seen a couple of people kind of go off script, and I think that that's actually where I am most interested, because I think that like we had a man from the UK who was giving a closing statement and went way off his script, and that gave me actually more of a window into what's going on. So it's not to say that prepared remarks aren't good, because they are. I get it. But definitely, like, I was always listening for, okay, when are they actually speaking from the heart?
And the questions that people have, like, at the end of the sessions when there's a Q&A, like, in the oceans when I went to earlier, like this young woman, asked at the end about like, well, like, what are we doing to hold the corporations accountable? And like, that's like the biggest elephant in the room, right? It's like, you have this whole session, like, you need to talk about these things because they're directly impacting like everything.
Or there was one that Marya, you and I were at together on critical minerals, and there was a question that came up of the question of conflict minerals, and the answer. You remember what the answer was that they?
I mean, the whole thing was that mining is good and inevitable, and how can women get a piece of the pie? But I don't remember on that.
Oh, there was one particular comment I remember. One of them said, which was, "Yes, conflict minerals is an important thing, and well, that should be talked about at an appropriate time." And it was a very good way to kind of, okay, yeah, it's important, but we won't do it right now, and probably won't at all in that particular instance, but but I mean, it really highlighted it, I thought, that very thing that you just said of, you know, making sure that women have a piece of a pie of something which has a certain injustice to it as well. And that gets at an issue really of that, I'm sure the three of you got to see during this time as well, competing interests, competing values, because there's a value to the idea of women and girls being able to advance career-wise, to be able to have you know, the same sort of access that, you know, in terms of work as men do and so forth. But then there's that other competing value, which is, but which types of activities have problems in and of themselves? And the extractive industry, I think, does kind of highlight that in there. Some of the others, I think, like the one that you mentioned, Rosie, about nutrition, that was a particularly good one in terms of the interests, I think, were pretty much coherent amongst themselves. Is that a fair estimate on the part of all of you? And we were all at that one together. That was one of the ones that we all went to. Just for all of you who are watching, once again, I'm throwing the questions out as I go, but if you have any, I haven't seen any come up on the chat yet, but please go ahead and throw questions out on the chat. A few of you have come in since the beginning, so I haven't, so you didn't hear me make that announcement at the very beginning, but please go on ahead and we'll field them here. That's because we'd like to have a chance for there to be that sort of moment of interaction as well. How would you say what you've seen might influence the work that you do in, you know, in FAN or in, you know, in the JPIC Commission or anything else that you're doing? What you see that has some sort of an impact for you as you go forward?
I think it reaffirmed for me the importance of storytelling along what Kelly was saying, and that, you know, you can hear all this data, but at the end of the day, what you remember is a story. And I think that that's a lot of the work that I've done with Pache Bene, which is my other job, founded by Franciscans, is storytelling. And I think that, you know, with FAN, we have people sending us, here's what's going on in my life. Here's how these very real policy things are affecting me and affecting the people around me. And I think that the more that we can get those stories heard and seen, the more effective we will be at the end of the day. And so I think it was just very affirming for me to look around and see all these people sharing their stories from their countries. And I think it just made me sort of remember that that is where so much of the power is, the clarity.
Yeah, I would echo that, especially because of the power of storytelling and advocacy. The other thing that I would say is it's kind of an increase, another motivator, and an increase and another sense of hope, because I think it's so easy to get bogged down in everything that's going wrong today and everything that's feeling stressful and hard and negative, but seeing just how many side events that we were at and how many people were doing amazing things and things that were moving future forward was really inspirational, and remember that a good reminder that there are good people doing good things, even when it doesn't feel like there are.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, I guess there's like two answers, like what I might like try to take out of this, like personally versus like for the Franciscan Federation JPIC Commission, because like, you know, personally, like, you know, I'm interested. I could follow up. That's what gets me in trouble. Is like I want to follow up on everything, right? I'm like, oh, let me go, you know, follow up with. I was on a webinar last week. My colleague organized this webinar with the Methodists, and it was like this guy from Malawi. I'm like, oh, I can follow up with him and, you know, make these connections, or I could do all these things, but like my day-to-day work is like more in terms of like domestic and like US like food policy and nutrition and public health. And so yeah, I could go in any sort of direction and, you know, follow up on things that I got here. But like for the JPIC Commission, it really depends on like what the other members of the Federation want to do in regards to JPIC, because everything is interconnected and all of these issues are important. And so, you know, we can start anywhere. You know, like I said, we could talk about the connection between like immigration and climate change, or, you know, like anything that people want to start with, like what are they working on and how can we work together more to address them? Yeah, and then I'm happy to share like the lessons learned in terms of like the CSW over the past couple of days, you know, to whatever extent that is helpful in clarifying or, you know, building more connections. But that's more of like a group effort in terms of what people want to work on.
Did you see things during this time, like in your work around food policy? So like questions that were talked about in terms of gender disparities in food access or food security at this level, and the kind of work which you do here in the US?
I mean, that's an interesting question because, yeah, like, you know, globally, you know, women are the main ones doing, I think it was like 80% are doing like the agricultural work or something. And, you know, we don't really see that context in the US. It's more like multinational corporations and like, you know, there's definitely disparities in terms of like, you know, farming and agriculture in the US, but it's not like subsistence farmers like it is in many other parts of the world. But I think that, but we do see there are like predominantly, I think the dietitians in the US are all, most of them are women. Right, so you do see this like this desire to be nurturing and to like make sure that like people are fed like healthy food is sort of common across the board. And I do think that we are entering a new phase of patriarchy and like, you know, all these other things in the US, right, that we haven't quite seen in a long time. So yeah, I guess there's definitely going to be more commonalities there, but I think that it's also important to recognize that there are many women across the world who have a lot more struggles than many of us do in the US. But I think there are definitely commonalities, but they're different in terms of how they play out. You know, I was reading this book about hunger in the US, and there are, you know, these intersectoral issues about poverty and hunger and violence, you know, and seen again across women. And that's something that has been documented in the US. And I think it's probably similar in other parts of the world. You know, we hear about the gender-based violence, and you hear about, you know, that women don't have enough access to, you know, what they need to really, you know, lift themselves and their communities and their families up. And yeah, I do think there are some similarities. You just have to talk about them in the context of, you know, the different communities, like, you know, like Rosie was saying with the storytelling and everything in different contexts. So.
Okay. We have a question from Sister Marie Lucy here. She says, yesterday I joined a webinar on the human cost of the US abandoning global aid. 3 Catholic sisters from Malawi, Kenya, and Guatemala described the harmful impacts, and the head of CRS also spoke. Did you hear from anyone about the impacts of USAID funding being reduced or eliminated, and what attitudes toward the US did you experience? Anybody can.
It didn't come up in the sessions that I was in. I didn't hear about it.
I heard some like, I'll say throwaway mentions of it, of like, or maybe not even direct mentions of it, of like, oh yeah, the aid being cut or the aid, you know, going away. I was expecting a little more, I'll say, like anti-US sentiment, but I think there was probably less of that given that where we are, and just in general trying to be diplomatic and things like that, and recognizing that the audience was probably pretty diverse, so not wanting to ruffle any feathers, but yes, those less direct mentions was certainly mentioned.
I would agree with Kelly and Eileen. Like, I heard rumblings, but not any outright things at the sessions that I attended.
Yeah.
There was in the session on Palestine that you were on, the woman next to me mentioned it, but it was like, you know, we don't need the money, but basically stop the interference. And I think, you know, another thing, obviously the US does give a lot for a lot of programs that do help people, but I think a lot of individuals and NGOs maybe that are more politically active also know that it comes at a political cost to them. So, you know, I don't think it means it's not such a black and white situation. So that's why I don't think, people would be so down on it, whether
Right.
it's here or there, because there are obviously costs to US support.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna it's obviously having a deep impact on the projects that were funded by USAID. But there's so many projects across the world that are funded by so many different groups, and that's the representation that we see here, so it's more spread out.
Yeah, and I also think we're waiting to see what the impact truly is too. Like, I think it's so relatively recent that we don't know everything that's gonna happen from it.
There are a couple of side events I went to where somebody did say, of course, it doesn't help that USAID has let go. So it's kind of like in this sort of, we'll include it in here as a statement that gets on the record, but not making it a key element of it. I think the main thing, which I actually heard in terms of criticism of the United States, had to do with the representation at the CSW in the form of some individuals not being able to get visas.
And
that came up in one of the sessions that I was in at one point as a pretty serious topic, actually. Just because, there were some individuals who were originally slated to address some part of the assembly, whether that was in the main ones or in the side events, and couldn't get visas. And of course, the US had made a commitment back, I guess it was during the Eisenhower years, to always make that possible, and wasn't made possible. So that makes it harder, of course. Kind of loops back to something was being said, that the two of you especially were talking about, but kind of all touched on some point or other, the stories. You don't get the stories out there if the storytellers can't have a microphone.
Yeah.
And that becomes a pretty key element, and getting a visa here is or for those who don't even need one anyway, because they're from countries that aren't required to get a visa to come to the United States. It's not so much of a difficulty, but then there's that disparity that then gets even more hit in terms of geopolitical realities, and not because of the UN, but because of, US immigration
Well, and what
policy.
countries do and don't have easy visa access and
Right.
things like that is just the broader systemic issue, I'll say.
And the complaints about visas here has been historic. At least, I mean, definitely
Right.
pre-Trump, so maybe it's a little bit worse now, but we have colleagues that have had to wait months and months and months to get an interview, and then it was,
Right.
can they come, can they not come, how do we plan?
Yeah, which I think is just which is another point of the importance of discussing immigration reform and the US immigration system as a whole.
Mm.
So ties back to our work in that way too.
Very much so. Very
Yeah,
much so.
yeah.
I'm glad that this is kind of coming together.
Right, which is,
Because one of the key things is how do we share our particular spheres, shall we say, or the areas in which we work in a way in which can help each other out as Franciscan institutions. I like the part about how stories kept coming up, especially because I think of there's one side event that I attended where I heard a lot of this percent and that percent and the other percent, and I'm thinking to myself, if somebody please put it on a chart, I'd certainly understand it then. I have a mathematics background myself, but it probably doesn't quite get that works out well when you're analyzing data on a more policy planning level. But doesn't say the same thing as the particular stories of people who are affected either positively or negatively by the various types of policies that are out there. Here we have another question. This is coming from Sister Kathy. Could you use the Zoom to take up the task of bringing persons from countries where visas are denied? I brought that one up to you actually when we were talking about this very thing, and I guess the UN has been reducing less the number of times or the extent to which online virtual methods are used for addressing the body. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, it's been really all over the place, especially post-COVID. So I have been at this, during this session, I've seen some people zooming in and giving a presentation. And then other sessions like across the UN, our colleagues at the Human Rights Council, and even here, a couple of years ago at the Permanent Forum, people could do recorded messages and send them in. And now we see that it's really by each session how it's established. So this is for the formal events. I mean, side events, it's really more at the discretion of the organizers and what they're able to organize tech-wise. But then the UN also has a budget crisis, and all of this online hybrid is, being impacted by that budget crisis.
Yeah.
And it's also, sorry,
They're good.
it's also a way, civil society after COVID has been saying, we were really able to participate. We don't have to spend so much money, and all of the hybrid opportunities were great. And with the limiting of them, one big issue is that coming in general in terms of the limiting of civic space. So it could be an excuse in some cases to say we don't have the budget, it's expensive, the tech isn't there in the room specifically, et cetera, et cetera. In other ways, it is a way for them to limit participation purposefully.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say I've seen some inside events, but I've had some side events where like, yep, this person's on Zoom, and the other ones where like Marya was saying, like they just are like, yeah, it didn't happen. So
The exception is like when the side event has somebody like the Deputy Secretary General giving an address. And then in that case, it's always permitted that the
Right.
that the video.
Right.
yeah, it depends on the caliber of the speaker.
Right, the higher.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously there are other issues where perhaps the Deputy Secretary General is being asked to address 5 side events that happen at the same time,
Right.
and it's very hard to be in all 5 of those at the same time anyway. So, but one thing which I did notice, I mean, certainly that there's a lot of our parallel events that are online, and some of them take place at hours that we're not awake here in New York. So that means that there is some activity that's going on, not very many of them, but a few of them were like at midnight, for example, or something like that. Now, of course, this is the city that never sleeps, but nonetheless, most of these kinds of events start no earlier than 8 a.m. and they're done no later than 9 p.m. And the bigger gap is between 10 and 4, basically. But that's one of the things that does help to get some of the stories out there a little more. At least some of the folks who go to some of the in-person ones are also involved with some of the online ones as well. So did you go to any of the online ones or all in person? Take advantage of the in-person ones while you're here.
Exactly.
You can do the online ones then when you're back in Washington, D.C.
We have time, but yeah. Yeah.
Here we have, in this time in the U.S. of discriminatory denial of visas, the use of Zoom can be a form of protest.
Absolutely, Sister Kathy.
Yes.
Yep, 100%.
And certainly, for protest and access, the two together. But the problem, there's a question of who has access to be able to get as close as possible to those higher level political types. And the way things are now.
Well, yeah, and then the privilege of being able to protest. Some people don't have that. Don't have that privilege and don't have the the either political capacity or personal safety capacity to do so. So yes, I agree that it can be a valuable one, but it's also a selectively valuable one. I'll say for sure.
We got 5 minutes left. Basically, say a key takeaway you're taking home with this.
But I also say,
Go for it.
As a question for next year, like, I don't want to say if you would recommend it, if you'd be, how you think it's valuable, maybe for others that might be interested in attending.
I think it's very valuable and I would highly recommend it. I think
Great.
I think it's animating. I think it gave me energy. and helped me kind of like Eileen was saying, you know, not feel so bogged down in the doom and gloom. So 10 out of 10.
Oh.
All right.
So Rosie, can you be part of our advertising?
Yeah. Comms director for FI, no.
Don't, if your score is less than 10 out of 10, or if it's greater, that's fine.
My key takeaway, and I mean, I've known this, but getting more of a concrete understanding of it is just how much exists outside of ourselves. And and so that's the big thing. And yeah, I think it's valuable even for people who are domestic policy focused, like all of us tend to be. We're seeing other ways people do things, because obviously the US's way of doing things is not by any means always the best way or the right way. And then also, yeah, just getting a deeper understanding and a broader understanding of everything happening in the world today and in the US too, and what that directly or indirectly impacts, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's valuable for everybody to come to these, and like I said earlier, to get more of like a concrete understanding of what's going on, at the local level, that examples of best practices and things that people are doing across the world. And I think, for some reason, the CSW seems to be predominantly, comprised of women, but I really think it should be more equitable in terms of like both men and women attending these. And they even have sessions like, what is the role of men in doing this work, right? And I think that's really important. And yeah, I think also just for me, because, and maybe for you guys as well, I don't know, but like, because we're so like in our day-to-day work, more like domestically focused, like, I think to be able to connect more and feel like we're having an impact through Franciscans International, it'd be helpful to like, have a concrete example of like what's actually like, who is a community that we can connect to on the ground in another country where, where there's Franciscan presence, and how is our, participation in these meetings, what can we learn here that's going to be impactful for them, or vice versa. I think more of that relationality, I think for me at least, would be helpful.
Yeah, and that sense of relationality is part of what takes place in all these different side events and everything, of this crisscrossing of people from all over. So an opportunity for at least in that moment a type of relationship that would never otherwise have existed. So okay. Well, this has been a great opportunity, I think, for us here in this room. I really want to thank all of you in your respective places who have joined us this afternoon. Please continue to follow the CSW, continue to follow FI, and continue to spread the word. Spread the word in your interactions with other Franciscans and in other networks of people who relate to Franciscans, but also just spread to make these things known, so we can continue to work together for justice, for peace, and for the good of the rights of human beings, and of the care and defense of creation as well. And so in closing, thank you very much, and pace bene.
Bye everyone.